Good morning. I'm Mark Cipolla. Welcome to the Cap and Invest Program pre-rulemaking workshop today. I'm going to wait just a minute or so for Zoom to fully populate the audience to make sure everybody's present and can hear. Okay, again, welcome to this pre-rulemaking workshop for the California Cap and Invest Program. I'm Mark Cipolla. I'm the chief of the Cap and Invest Program for CARB. This is another in a series of informal workshops that CARB has been holding over the past couple years related to potential updates to the Cap and Invest program. Today, we're discussing recent direction from the California legislature in two recent bills, specifically AB 1207, authored by Assemblymember Irwin, and SB 840, authored by Senator Limón. These were adopted in September and signed by the governor. So we're here to discuss potential implementation of those bills. And I'll note that AB 1207 officially changed our name. So the California Cap and Trade Program, which started in 2013 and has been operating successfully for over a decade, is now the California Cap and Invest Program. We're embracing that now and going forward. So same program, different name. High-level agenda for today. There'll be just a CARB staff presentation followed by a Q&A session. There's a lot to discuss, so I expect the presentation to be over an hour, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. Presenting for CARB today will be Michael Turgeon and Jason Zhao. And Haley Hamza will be managing the public comment session. We are also joined today on a panel to help respond to questions and participate in the Q&A by Adam Banasiak from the California Public Utilities Commission. And we also have with us Deputy Executive Officer Rajinder Sahota from CARB, overseeing climate change and research. Ryan Shalland, who is the chief for the mandatory reporting regulation for greenhouse gases. And we also have Rachel Gold, who is a manager within the Cap and Invest program over allowance allocation. So again, we have a little over an hour for the CARB staff presentation. I'm going to call on Michael Turgeon to begin that presentation now.
Thank you, Mark. In the slide set up here. Okay, so a few more workshop logistics before we get started. This workshop is being recorded and will be posted on the Cap and Trade Meetings and Workshops webpage, where you can find material for today's workshop and a link to CARB's public comment docket. The deadline to submit written feedback is November 12th, 2025. After the presentation today, we'll have a public comment period to hear your feedback and answer any questions. We'll call on commenters in order of hands raised, and everyone will get 2 minutes to speak, no ceding time to others. As the market administrators, we may decline to answer questions, and we are mindful of sharing market-related information in this setting with a limited audience as opposed to more broadly through a market notice. So here are today's topics. Two recently adopted bills, AB 1207 and SB 840, officially extend the program through 2045 while making updates to program mechanics and providing direction to CARB on program implementation going forward. I'll provide some context for that legislation, and then I'll cover potential program updates, including 1, setting the annual allowance budgets going forward, 2, removing allowances for future offset use, which is a new provision in AB 1207. 3, how to minimize emissions leakage, i.e. how to support clean, efficient industrial production in California. And 4, the transition of free allowances from gas utilities to electric utilities, which is another AB 1207 requirement. We'll follow this with the public comment period and then go over next steps. Let's set the stage with some high-level context. This chart shows California's progress toward its statewide greenhouse gas or GHG reduction targets. The line graph shows annual emissions from 2000 to 2022 and the targets for 2020, 2030, and 2045. In 2006, the California legislature set our initial 2020 target of returning to 1990 emissions levels, which is 431 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. The GHG inventory shows that California achieved that target in 2014 and has remained below the target through 2022. In 2016, the legislature called for a 40% reduction in GHG emissions below 1990 levels by 2030. And in 2022, AB 1279 established 2 goals: to reduce anthropogenic GHG emissions by 85% by 2045 compared to 1990 levels, and to achieve carbon neutrality no later than 2045, meaning that for whatever emission sources exist at that point, there is an equivalent or greater amount of natural or technological carbon sinks. And here in California, the stakes of climate action are high, and the impacts of climate change are happening now. Among US states, ours is one of the most sensitive to natural disasters fueled by climate change that cause billions in damages. These disasters are already causing affordability concerns in the home insurance market, as many Californians live in areas of increasing climate threat. The threat of wildfires has already cost us hundreds of billions over the past 11 years, with over 50,000 lives lost due to toxic wildfire smoke, and extreme heat events have added billions in economic losses. The costs of damages here don't even include the wildfires in Southern California from the beginning of the year. Without additional action, these impacts will only get worse. There is no choice but to act on the science and limit greenhouse gas emissions. Given the increasing threats and well-established science, over the past 20 years, the legislature and different governors have acted to address climate change. As mentioned, some of these bills set statewide GHG reduction targets. AB 32 set the original 2020 target of returning to 1990 GHG levels and authorized market mechanisms such as the Cap and Invest program to achieve this target. In 2016, SB 32 set the 2030 target. In 2017, AB 398 officially extended the program to 2030 while making some targeted changes. And in 2022, AB 1279 set the 2045 target, 85% below 1990 levels and achieving carbon neutrality. This year, AB 1207 extended the program through 2045 and provided direction on certain program features. With this bill, the legislature has affirmed the role of Cap and Invest in achieving the 2045 GHG target. Simultaneously, SB 840 sets the appropriation of future state revenues from quarterly Cap and Invest allowance auctions and directs CARB to evaluate the latest science and update elements of the compliance offset program within Cap and Invest. And both of these bills require additional technical work from CARB staff and new reporting to the legislature. AB 1207 requirements include presenting to the legislative committees on rulemaking efforts, expenditures of program revenues from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, or GGRF, and annual use of allocated allowance value by electrical utilities. AB 1207 also requires discussion of potential program changes in CARB's climate change scoping plan, which is updated every 5 years, and AB 1207 requires CARB to consider adopting new compliance offset protocols, such as for carbon dioxide removal. This provision provides an important market signal for the importance of carbon dioxide removal in achieving the state's climate targets. SB 840 requires CARB to study the compliance offset program and how it supports California's climate goals by December 2026. It also requires updating all offset protocols by January 2029 and reevaluating all protocols every 5 years. Accomplishing this will necessitate additional resources starting in the next fiscal year. And there are a few other key pieces of context to understand before we dive into potential program updates. First, CARB's most recent scoping plan update charted a course to carbon neutrality by 2045 and looked at what GHG reduction trajectories may be needed to get us there. Second, recent editions of CARB's GHG emission inventory show downward adjustments to prior year emissions totals due to technical methodology updates, which necessitate corresponding changes to cap and invest allowance budgets that were set based on the earlier inventory estimates. Third, the US federal government is significantly reducing its efforts to fight climate change. Repealed federal regulations, tax credits, and other funding opportunities mean California needs to step up its efforts to support cost-effective decarbonization, keep clean industrial production in the state, and consider affordability as outlined in recent bills. Regarding federal regulations, note that EPA's proposed repeal of its GHG reporting requirements does not impact CARB's requirements under the Mandatory Reporting Regulation, or MRR. Potential program updates discussed today continue the robust pre-rulemaking process that began in 2023 and has included a series of public workshops and community meetings to present and discuss regulatory concepts. Here's a bit more detail on the changes to the federal GHG reporting program. EPA's proposed rollback of GHG reporting requirements applies to most source categories under Section 40, Part 98 of the Federal Code of Regulations. MRR references previous versions of 40 CFR Part 98 for reporting methods and emissions factors for imported electricity, and these previous versions are incorporated by reference and thus are not impacted by the current EPA action. Separately, MRR Section 95111 uses Part 98 GHG data where available to calculate emissions factors for imported electricity. CARB can instead use EIA data for fuel consumption and net electricity generation, which is still being reported, and staff are considering minor edits to MRR to clarify how to calculate emissions factors when both EPA and EIA data aren't available. Now we'll turn to potential updates to the Cap and Invest program, starting with new direction from AB 1207. AB 1207 requires CARB to consider affordability when assessing any potential program changes. It also requires CARB to retire allowances from annual budgets corresponding with compliance offset use, to continue considering how to minimize industrial emissions leakage, and to transition free allowances from gas utilities to electric utilities by 2031, with the value of these allowances used to fund on-bill climate credits for electric ratepayers. AB 1207 also reaffirms that allowance budgets should be set to support achieving the state's legislative GHG targets for 2030 and 2045. Staff emphasized that CARB must review potential updates to program provisions in the context of the overall program and not in isolation. Cumulative impacts are evaluated in the context of climate targets, consideration of affordability, program stability, and the need for a steadily increasing price signal for investment in clean energy and technology. These next slides cover developing potential program allowance budgets through 2030 and 2045. Annual allowance budgets through 2020 were established in the 2010 rulemaking, and budgets through 2030 were established in the 2016 rulemaking. Early year allowance budgets were established using the best available data to estimate emissions for the year that a covered source category entered the program. The annual budgets were then set to decline linearly to the 2020 allowance budget of 334.2 million allowances. The 2020 budget was calculated as the 2020 statewide GHG target multiplied by 77.5%, which is the percentage of emissions from the statewide GHG emissions inventory estimated to be covered by the program. In the 2016 rulemaking, annual 2021 through 2030 allowance budgets were set to decline linearly from the established 2020 allowance budget to a 2030 allowance budget that reflects the statewide SB 32 GHG reduction target, which is a 40% reduction relative to 1990 levels. The 2030 allowance budget was similarly calculated as 77.5% of the 2030 SB 32 target, again using the percentage of statewide emissions previously projected to be covered by the program in 2020. Looking forward, staff have evaluated a range of potential allowance budget scenarios through 2030 and into the post-2030 program. The process to develop potential budgets builds upon budget evaluations in the 2010 and 2016 rulemakings. And in developing annual allowance budgets, staff must balance multiple considerations, including supporting state climate targets, considering consumer affordability, cost effectiveness, and technological feasibility, minimizing the risk of emissions leakage, enabling a smooth transition to the post-2030 program, maintaining cost containment mechanisms to protect against price volatility, and avoiding disproportionate impacts on low-income communities. Many of these considerations are legislative directives, and any proposal to adjust budgets must also work within rulemaking timelines. CARB has determined that the adjusted timeline to complete the rulemaking in 2026 means that 2027 is the earliest year available for budget adjustments and other potential updates to the program. To align allowance budgets with the 40% GHG reduction target for 2030, CARB must remove approximately 118 million allowances in total from the 2027 through 2030 annual budgets. With only 4 budget years available, removing additional allowances beyond the 118 million may increase compliance challenges and could have impacts on consumer affordability. After 2030, CARB is proposing a smooth decline in annual allowance budgets towards a 2045 endpoint aligned with the statewide 85% GHG reduction target. The portion of remaining GHG emissions occurring in sectors covered by the program in 2045 is based on historic and projected emissions data from MRR and the 2022 Scoping Plan Update emissions modeling. Post-2030, staff is also proposing to gradually remove additional allowances such that the cumulative total allowance budget from 2027 to 2045 is aligned with the scoping plan and the allowance budget scenarios analyzed in the 2024 SRIA and prior pre-rulemaking workshops. Finally, note that these allowance removals won't touch the allowance price containment reserve or price ceiling accounts, as those allowances serve a critical cost containment function and their uses are limited by statute. Further, staff propose continuing to deposit a small amount of the allowance budget each year into APCR Tier 1 to further support compliance cost containment. Next, I'll discuss the new provision in AB 1207 to remove allowances corresponding to offset use for compliance. Here's the relevant legislative text from AB 1207. Note that this requirement applies to allowance budgets set for the entire program and does not apply to individual entities fulfilling their compliance obligations. Below are 2 critical considerations for implementing this new requirement. First, note that historic offset use has followed a predictable pattern of spiking in the year following a multi-year compliance period. In early years of a compliance period, covered entities must surrender allowances and offsets for only 30% of the previous year's covered emissions. After a 3-year compliance period, covered entities are required to surrender allowances and offsets for all of the previous year's covered emissions, plus that remaining 70% of covered emissions from the 2 years before that. This means that offset use in the year after the final year of a compliance period is much higher than in the prior 2 years. Multi-year compliance periods provide flexibility in compliance planning for covered entities, and CARB staff expect the historic spikes in offset use to continue in future compliance periods. Thus, implementing AB 1207 allowance removals for offset use could lead to predictable variability in the annual supply of allowances available for auction. I will illustrate this in the next slides using publicly available data from our website. Second, note that in prior rulemakings, allowances from future budgets were transferred to the APCR corresponding to projected use of offsets within the usage limit. So there has already been downward adjustments to the allowances made available to the market to account for offset credit use. Since the beginning, CARB has been implementing the concept of offsets under the cap, but through a different mechanism that did not introduce the type of variability potentially introduced through the new mechanism in AB 1207. Given language in AB 398, we do not believe the allowances in the current APCR are available to be removed for offset use under AB 1207. This table shows the historic use of offset credits for compliance as posted on CARB's webpage, alongside the corresponding offset usage limit and compliance event type for a given year. Annual compliance events require covered entities to surrender allowances or offsets for 30% of their covered emissions from the prior year, while triennial compliance events require 100% of covered emissions from the prior year, plus that remaining 70% of covered emissions from the 2 previous years. Note the spike in offset use for triennial compliance events compared to annual compliance events. For example, 3.7 million offset credits were used for the annual compliance event in November 2020, and then 52.6 million were used the next year for the full compliance period event in November 2021. This graph illustrates the potential impact on the number of state-owned allowances available for auction when allowances are removed to account for offset usage on an ongoing basis and not as historically done in the program. Using the historic data on offset use, you can see graphically how implementing allowance removals from the budget year immediately after each compliance event would have impacted the number of state-owned allowances available for auction in previous years. Note the significant decrease in allowances for auction in 2019 and 2022, as these years follow triennial compliance events in 2018 and 2021. And again, this is all public data that can be replicated by any stakeholder. And this, sorry, slide issue here. Apologies, need to reset that momentarily. Okay, returning to it, this table shows the corresponding hypothetical impact to historic state auction proceeds following a spike in offset use during a full compliance period compliance event. To generate this table, staff used publicly available auction results for settlement prices and the number of allowances sold. Implementing AB 1207 on future allowance budgets as envisioned could create volatility in state auction proceeds used for GGRF programs. So given this new provision in AB 1207, CARB staff is requesting stakeholder feedback on the following. 1, does the predictable variability in allowances available for auction under this provision pose a market concern? And 2, are there alternative implementation suggestions for this provision that minimize the predictable variability for auction? And now I will hand it over to my colleague Jason Zhao to present on minimizing emissions leakage under Cap and Invest.
Thanks, Michael. I'm going to provide some background information on emissions leakage and strategies to mitigate emissions leakage to provide some context for discussing concepts related to industrial allocation. So what is emissions leakage? When greenhouse gas emissions are priced in some jurisdictions, but not globally, businesses in regulated regions may face higher costs. These added costs can affect their competitiveness compared to businesses that don't face a price on emissions. If, as a result, production or investment shifts from California to regions with weaker or no climate regulations, global emissions may increase even as California's emissions decline. This phenomenon is known as emissions leakage. AB 32 requires CARB to minimize emissions leakage to the extent feasible. The California Cap and Invest program currently uses two key tools to address emissions leakage. The first is providing free allowances to energy-intensive, trade-exposed, or EITE industrial sectors. The second is a mix of electricity sector safeguards, including robust reporting and verification requirements for electricity imports, provision against resource shuffling, and accounting for leakage from imported electricity in the Western Energy Imbalance Market, or EIM, through retirement of allowances via EIM outstanding emissions. First, let's talk about the industrial sector. The primary mechanism to distribute free allowances to industrial facilities is the product-based allocation methodology. The general equation for this allocation is shown on the slide, where a facility's allocation is equal to the assistance factor based on leakage risk, which AB 398 set at 100% for all sectors through 2030, multiplied by the sector benchmark, which is a published factor in the regulation representing GHG emissions per unit of product, multiplied by the cap adjustment factor, which decreases each year at the same rate of the overall cap, and multiplied by the facility's output, which is reported and verified annually through our mandatory GHG reporting program. Most facilities use the standard cap adjustment factor. Some facilities, those with over 50% of total emissions from process emissions, high emissions intensity, and a high leakage risk classification, use the alternate cap adjustment factor, which declines each year at half the rate as the standard cap adjustment factor. Here is an overview of the industrial subsectors that received allowance allocation for 2023 and the number of facilities in each subsectors. Now let's move on to the electricity sector. Under AB 32, CARB must account for statewide GHG emissions, including all emissions resulting from the generation of electricity delivered to and consumed in California, whether that electricity is generated in state or imported to California to serve California load. Under the regulation, the first deliverer of electricity, or the entity that first delivers electricity onto the California electricity grid, is responsible for the compliance obligation associated with the delivered electricity. Under the first deliverer approach, all electricity importers and in-state generators are treated the same, limiting the potential for emissions leakage. Resource shuffling, which is a type of emissions leakage, is a plan to substitute lower GHG emissions power for higher GHG emissions power in order to reduce a compliance obligation associated with imported electricity. CARB adopted strict provision against resource shuffling in the regulation. The regulation also includes safe harbor provisions, which describe allowable imported electricity deliveries that do not constitute resource shuffling. CARB has demonstrated the ability to detect and address sources of emissions leakage in the electricity sector. In 2015, CARB found that the design of the California Independent System Operator Western Energy Imbalance Market does not account for the full GHG emissions experienced by the atmosphere from electricity imported to California under EIM, and this can result in emissions leakage. Starting April 1st, 2019, electrical distribution utilities that for a given year both receive a Cap and Invest program free allowance allocation and purchase electricity through EIM have the responsibility for addressing EIM outstanding emissions for that year. CARB directly retires a portion of the allowances that are freely allocated to these utilities. AB 398 requires CARB to report to the legislature by December 31st, 2025. The report should include the progress toward meeting the GHG emissions reduction targets and the emissions leakage risk posed by the cap and trade regulation, and recommendations to the legislature on necessary statutory changes to the program to reduce leakage while maintaining the state's ability to reach its target. To support this effort, CARB established 2 contracts with research teams. One focused on leakage in the electricity sector and one for the industrial sector. Some of what you see here today will also be included in the report due at the end of this year. One contractor conducted a retrospective study to evaluate emissions leakage in the electricity sector from inception of the program through 2021. The study developed a marginal emission rate approach, which allowed them to estimate the annual emissions caused by California's electricity imports each year, or the amount of potential emissions leakage. Key findings include that there is no evidence of resource shuffling as defined under the regulation. Emissions leakage is occurring, but not necessarily due to the program, and historical procurement of large hydroelectric consumption was a driver of emissions leakage. Two complementary estimation approaches were also developed in the study. First, a marginal emissions estimation method was developed to quantify the amount of emissions caused by California import each year. The study compared multi-year changes in estimates of the import-driven emissions to the reductions in emissions from imports reported to CARB via the mandatory reporting regulation. Second, an attributional approach was applied to compare trends in the output of reported sources with their observed output overall. Both approaches indicate that roughly half of the 29 million metric tons CO2 equivalent reduction in annual imported electricity emissions from 2011 to 2021 could be construed as leakage. About half of the emissions reductions were from retiring coal and procurement of new renewable sources and not leakage. The study identified several categories of leakage with varying risks. No leakage risk was tied to the volume of imports each year, and low leakage risk was associated with imports from new zero carbon generation and reduced imports from fossil fuel plants with retiring units. High leakage risk was assigned to emissions reduction that were traced to changes in the mix of imports from fossil fuel plants. The largest sources of emissions leakage risk was found to be from increasing import from pre-existing hydroelectric sources. In analysis of power content label data from the California Energy Commission, the study found that during 2014 to 2022, community choice aggregators, or CCAs, consumed increasing amounts of hydroelectric power compared to their IOU and POU counterparts. The data suggests increased large hydroelectric consumption by CCA customers displaced fossil fuel consumption by IOU customers. The analysis did not find evidence that this emission leakage was caused by activities that violate the leakage minimization requirements or resource shuffling provisions of the program. However, there is evidence of emissions leakage, which may be driven by other policies and factors, such as RPF targets, consumer choice, and local carbon neutrality goals. It also appears that these trends were historic and may not reflect CCA procurement going forward. The other contractor conducted a forward-looking study on the risk of emissions leakage for the emission-intensive and trade-exposed industrial sector covered by the Cap and Invest program in the context of the 2030 and 2045 GHG emissions reduction targets. This analysis assumed that gross domestic product and energy efficiency were projected to increase based on 2022 laws and regulations, and that basic economic behavior, including demand, supply, and trade responsiveness to changing prices, remain constant at the 2019 level. the research concluded that current output-based allocation is effective at addressing EITE leakage risk. Border carbon adjustments can mitigate leakage and reduce non-California EITE emissions. Targeted EITE electrification subsidies could be an effective tool for EITE sectors with electrification potential, and incentivizing research and development that lowers costs for advanced zero or low carbon technology could be particularly effective in mitigating leakage for hard to decarbonize sectors. These findings align with findings in past leakage studies conducted for CARB by third parties, the broader economic leakage literature, and CARB's own analysis. Due to various changed circumstances, including changes in the federal administration, removal of federal funding for decarbonization efforts, changes to the economic outlook, including tariff, and limited time, the findings highlighted here from this work are most relevant to our AB 398 analysis, and there is no final report from this contract. During the initial program rulemaking in 2010, CARB developed a leakage analysis for the cap-and-trade regulation. It evaluated emissions leakage risk for industrial subsectors at the 6-digit NAICS code level, using a combination of emissions intensity and trade exposure metrics. So what are these metrics? Emissions intensity is the volume of total GHG emissions per unit of economic output. Sectors with higher emissions intensities are likely to face higher compliance costs. Trade exposure is defined as the ratio of total trade activity to domestic consumption. This metric reflects the extent to which a sector is engaged in markets outside of California relative to its activity within the state. Greater trade exposure indicates that a sector faces greater competition from firms in other jurisdictions. As a result, such sectors are generally less able to pass on additional compliance costs to consumers due to the risk of losing market share to out-of-state competitors. In response to AB 398, CARB staff recently updated the leakage risk assessment using the same approach as the 2010 assessment, but with more recent data for key industrial sectors. The key takeaway of this assessment is that overall leakage risk classifications for these sectors remain consistent over the years. While data-driven assessments are essential for understanding emissions leakage risk within the current economic and policy landscape, we must also adopt a broader perspective. This includes proactively considering strategies to mitigate future leakage risk, especially in light of evolving industrial decarbonization challenges, such as loss of federal funding, emerging emissions trading systems in other jurisdictions, and global trade disruptions such as tariffs. Given that information, as we consider how best to mitigate industrial emissions leakage moving forward, it's also valuable considering the approaches used in other jurisdictions with emission trading systems that cover industrial facilities. This slide provides an overview of those approaches. Globally, most ETS, including California's, provide free allowance allocation to covered industrial facilities. As mentioned earlier, allocation is typically calculated by multiplying a benchmark emissions intensity by a facility's output in a given year and one or more adjustment factors. And free allocation has been observed to be largely effective at mitigating leakage. Some jurisdictions have additional tools to both reduce emissions and address leakage risks. For example, starting in 2024, Quebec revised its allocation rules to consign a portion of industrial allocation allowances to auction, with the resulting revenue earmarked for emissions reduction projects by EITE industries. Meanwhile, the European Union is phasing out free allocation for at-risk industry sectors and phasing in a carbon border adjustment mechanism, or CBAM. starting full implementation in 2027. This mechanism is currently in a reporting-only phase and applies to imports in specific covered sectors, aiming to level the playing field between domestic producers and foreign competitors. With that context, this table compares levels of industrial allowance allocation in 2023 across jurisdictions. The ratio of industrial allocation to industrial covered emission is an important factor in assessing the effectiveness of allocation for mitigating leakage risk. The percentages presented here reflect total industrial allocation, total industrial covered emissions, and emissions abatement by industrial facilities in response to carbon price. On average, California's cap and invest program has lower levels of allowance allocation relative to covered emissions compared to other jurisdictions. It should be noted that these other jurisdictions are implementing changes going forward, some of which were presented on the prior slide, and that include the EU is gradually phasing in a CBAM for selected high leakage risk sectors, while simultaneously phasing out free allocation. The UK is also actively considering the implementation of a CBAM. Quebec is reducing free industrial allocation and consigning a portion of industrial allocation to auction, with proceeds supporting emissions reduction projects at emission-intensive and trade-exposed facilities. With that, I'll turn the presentation back to Michael.
Thank you, Jason. With that context, we are looking at what California's manufacturing sector is facing in order to achieve deep decarbonization. This includes uncertain economic pressures from factors outside the program, including tariffs and the loss of federal funding, particularly for first-of-a-kind industrial decarbonization projects. The manufacturing sector can be difficult to decarbonize due to high heat requirements and limited cost-effective technologies to reduce emissions for some industrial processes. Given these challenges, staff is evaluating whether more targeted support could assist the manufacturing sector to decarbonize, minimize emissions leakage, and support California industry and workers. Incentivizing decarbonization projects in the manufacturing sector can support GHG reductions, lower compliance costs, and help mitigate emissions leakage. One example, as Jason noted earlier, is Quebec's approach to designating some industrial allocation to support decarbonization projects. In California, that potentially could look like providing support through an incentive for facilities that demonstrate investments in specific decarbonization activities. Some examples of what those activities could be include facility electrification, development of on-site renewables, and the use of low-carbon fuels such as renewable natural gas. Incentive eligibility could be determined by an upfront application to CARB with ongoing requirements for regular reporting to CARB on these projects and expenditures. So returning now to AB 1207, the bill text presented here provides updated direction to CARB on allowance allocation to mitigate emissions leakage risk. The bill maintains all assistance factors for leakage risk at 100% through 2030. It removes the requirement for cap adjustment factors to be proportional to the overall allowance budgets, and it provides additional flexibility to CARB in determining the approach to mitigating leakage risk after 2030. This graph shows the cap adjustment factor and alternate cap adjustment factor in the current regulation through 2030. The standard cap adjustment factor is used to calculate the vast majority of industrial allocation. The cap adjustment factor is included in that calculation so that allocation remains a relatively steady portion of the overall allowance budget, which ensures sufficient allowances are available for auction and other program purposes. The current schedule of decline for the cap adjustment factor and alternate cap adjustment factor is important context as we now look at potential AB 1207 implementation concepts for mitigating leakage risk. The annually declining cap adjustment factor is the primary reason that the ratio of industrial allocation to covered emissions is low in California relative to other jurisdictions. Given the need to remove 118 million allowances from program budgets through 2030, the challenges for industrial decarbonization, and the requirement to minimize emissions leakage, staff is considering updates to the cap adjustment factor and alternate cap adjustment factor for industrial allowance allocation. Concept 1 on this slide follows the historic approach, where the cap adjustment factor declines in proportion to annual allowance budgets, and the alternate cap adjustment factor declines at half that rate. With additional removals from the overall budget through 2030, applying the historic approach would accelerate the decrease in industrial allocation for all facilities. Concept 2 would instead maintain the cap adjustment factor and alternate cap adjustment factor schedule in the current regulation, rather than resetting them to be proportional to the new allowance budgets. Implementing Concept 2 would increase allocation for leakage protection relative to the historic approach in Concept 1. This table shows the projected impact of Concept 1 and Concept 2 relative to the current regulation baseline through 2030. Note that Concept 2 provides the same level of support to industrial facilities as the baseline, despite the more reduced overall allowance budgets. These pie charts show the share of total allowance budgets used for industrial allocation versus other program priorities under Concept 1, Concept 2, and the baseline through 2030. Note that Concepts 1 and 2 have 118 million fewer total allowances through 2030 and reflect other proposed updates, resulting in lower utility allocation than under the current regulation. Regarding industrial allowance allocation, CARB staff seek stakeholder feedback on the following. 1, with adjusted allowance budgets, what level of industrial allocation is necessary to protect against emissions leakage? And 2, given the loss of federal funding, should CARB use the Cap and Invest program to increase support for industrial decarbonization projects that reduce GHG emissions and protect against leakage in California? If so, what sectors and facility investments should be eligible for this support under Cap and Invest? And what approach should CARB take to designing and implementing such an approach? Next, I will discuss the transition in utility allowance allocation required under AB 1207. For context, CARB allocates allowances to electrical distribution utilities, or EDUs, and natural gas suppliers, or NGS, on behalf of their ratepayers. Natural gas suppliers have been covered by the Cap and Trade program and have received free allowance allocation since 2015. The number of allowances allocated to each natural gas supplier each year is calculated based on its 2011 covered emissions reported under MRR, excluding emissions associated with natural gas sales to facilities that are directly covered by the program, and the standard cap adjustment factor, which declines each year in proportion to the overall annual caps. Annually, investor-owned utilities, or IOUs, receive around 98% of the total natural gas supplier allocation, and more than 75% of all natural gas IOU proceeds have been returned to residential customers as a California climate credit. Natural gas suppliers are required to consign a minimum percentage of their allocated allowances to auction, increasing 5% per year. That percentage is at 75% for 2025 and will increase to 100% in 2030. This chart shows natural gas supplier allowance allocation and allowances consigned to auction under the current regulation. Data for 2026 through 2030 is projected, and the data for early years are the actual amounts. Note that the total NGS allocation decreases each year in line with the cap adjustment factor, while the minimum proportion of NGS allowances consigned to auction increases by 5% each year until reaching 100% in 2030. Most NGS allowances go to the IOUs and are used to fund the residential California climate credit on natural gas bills. Allowance allocation to electrical and natural gas IOUs is overseen by CARB and the California Public Utilities Commission, or CPUC. CARB determines the number of allowances provided to each IOU and annually allocates those allowances. CARB also determines the allowable uses of allocated allowance value, aligned with legislative direction, and provides oversight to ensure the requirements for annual use of allowance value are met. The CPUC determines the eligibility and methods for how IOU auction proceeds for utilities like PG&E, SCE, SDG&E, and SoCalGas are distributed to residential customers, small businesses, EITE facilities, and eligible clean energy and energy efficiency programs. CPUC oversight includes the number and value of climate credits, approving on and off-bill messaging, and the eligible amounts of administrative and outreach costs. As discussed, under the current regulation, both natural gas and electric IOUs provide credits to ratepayers using auction proceeds from the program. These credits include the California Climate Credit, which is an on-bill credit that goes to natural gas IOU residential ratepayers and electric IOU residential ratepayers. There's also the Small Business California Climate Credit, which is an on-bill credit that goes to electric IOU small business ratepayers. And there's California Industrial Assistance, which is an on-bill credit that goes to electric IOU ratepayers from eligible emissions-intensive trade-exposed industries. This credit applies to both covered and non-covered industrial entities. And note that the natural gas IOU proceeds are only returned as a residential climate credit, and the other climate credits are applicable only to electric IOUs. AB 1207 updates the Health and Safety Code, section 38562B, to require CARB to transition free allowance allocation from natural gas corporations to electrical distribution utilities on or before January 1st, 2031. The term gas corporations is defined in Public Utilities Code, section 222, as investor-owned utilities. The term electrical distribution utilities is defined in the Cap and Trade regulation as investor-owned utilities, local publicly owned electric utilities, or POUs, and electrical cooperatives, or co-ops. Additionally, updates to Public Utilities Code section 748.5.5a require electric POUs to provide a credit in an amount equal to the total value of that additional allocation directly to ratepayers. The term local publicly owned electric utility is defined in PUC section 224.3 as municipal utilities, public utility districts, and irrigation districts. The definition does not include electrical co-ops, such as Plumas Sierra Electrical Cooperative and Anza Electrical Cooperative. So these maps show the service territory of the 7 natural gas suppliers and 54 electrical distribution utilities that receive free allowance allocation under the program. When we think about the transition of free allowances from natural gas corporations to electrical distribution utilities, it's important to note that their service territories don't directly overlap, which is a key consideration when we think about how to distribute the natural gas allowances to EDUs. This mismatch of service regions makes the transfer more complicated and raises some technical questions that need more thought. Under the current regulation, EDU, POUs, and co-ops have historically spent allocated allowance value on renewable energy projects and purchases, energy efficiency projects, and transportation electrification. A few EDU, POUs have provided climate credits, such as Azusa, Gridley, Lodi, Lompoc, Redding, Shasta Lake, Silicon Valley Power, and the city of Victorville. Allowance allocation is provided to 48 EDU, POUs, and co-ops. The largest of these in 2026 was the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, with over 9 million allowances, and the smallest was Eastside with 573 allowances. Additionally, several EDUs have no residential ratepayers, such as the Port of Stockton and the Port of Oakland. This context is important as we consider how to implement this AB 1207 requirement. And as mentioned, per AB 1207, POUs that receive additional allowances that are transitioned from natural gas allocation would need to provide on-bill climate credits to residential ratepayers. So CARB requests feedback on the following questions. How should CARB treat natural gas POUs when considering the AB 1207 allowance allocation changes? When should the transition of natural gas supplier allocation to EDUs begin? What pace should the transition of natural gas allocation to EDUs occur? How should additional allowances transferred from natural gas suppliers be divided up amongst the EDUs? Should the EDUs without residential customers be provided additional allocation? How should electrical cooperatives and federal power marketing administrators be treated? And what, if any, other elements should we consider in implementing these requirements? So moving now to next steps. CARB aims to achieve regulatory certainty as soon as possible. Regulatory certainty will inform planning by regulated entities for updated allowance budgets through 2030. It will help maintain momentum for clean energy and technology investments, especially in light of uncertainty in federal policies. And it allows for linkage analysis to support potential future linkage with the Washington program. Board considerations of amendments needs to occur by the end of Q2 2026, with the goal of having the amended regulation in effect by September 1st, 2026, which all means that we are actively working on releasing a draft, hopefully by the end of this year. There will be multiple opportunities for public input after the rulemaking package has been released, including a 45-day public comment period and board hearing comments. All right, so we'll now open up the workshop for public comment. If you'd like to share feedback or ask questions, please use the raise hand function, which should be located on the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom window as shown. When staff calls your name and activates your audio controls, please click the unmute button, proceed to introduce yourself with your name and your affiliation, and provide your comment. To accommodate as many people as we can, comments today are limited to 2 minutes and there's no ceding time to others. I'll pull up a timer here shortly to show the time remaining for each commenter. We'll call on commenters in order of hands raised, and we'll do our best to get to everyone. We'll also try to make sure everyone gets a chance to comment before circling back to any duplicate commenters. But if we do not call on you prior to the meeting ending, please submit written comments, which you can submit online until November 12th at 11:59 p.m. Pacific time. You can find a link to submit feedback as well as all relevant documents on our Cap and Trade meetings and workshops page. And with that, I will now pass the mic to my colleague, Haley Hamza, who will be facilitating the public comment session.
Thanks, Michael. Hello, everyone, and thank you for participating in our public comment section of this workshop. Right now, we have 11 hands raised, and I will be proceeding as first raised hand through the list. So Teresa Lang, you are our first commenter, and Brian Beering, you will be our second commenter. Teresa, I have allowed you to unmute yourself. You have 2 minutes to present your public comment.
Hi, thank you, Haley. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So my name is Teresa Lang with A New Climate, and I wanted to thank CARB for the presentation today. Very helpful. I have 2 questions and a comment. The comment first, I wanted to note that we really appreciate the thought and analysis you've put into the 1207 provision on allowance removals for offset use. As you note, offset use increases in the year following the last year of a compliance period as multi-year compliance obligations are fulfilled. And so implementation of this provision could result in highly variable allowance auctions, which I could imagine would be problematic. So just wanted to note, we really appreciate the opportunity to comment on this and look forward to considering those alternative implementation suggestions when we do submit comments. My questions are related to other elements of the offset program. Prior to the pause in the rulemaking earlier this year, CARB was considering a number of updates to regulations related to the offset program, as well as updates to the livestock, mine methane, and ODS protocols. And CARB had planned to commence a separate rulemaking to update forest protocols at a future date. So because you didn't mention it today, I'm just curious, does CARB still plan to include the previously planned offset program updates in this rulemaking, including those protocol updates? And then secondly, when can we expect work to begin on updating the forestry protocol? Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Teresa. Yeah, we are focusing on the new information here, but the information that we provided in the previous workshop still stand. We do expect to move forward with the updates that are being to put forward a proposal on updates to the 3 offset protocols. And then once we have complete information from our the contract that we've been working through, we anticipate working through and putting forward a proposal on the forest protocol after this rulemaking is wrapped up and we have complete information to move forward on that. So we do recognize that there is some additional direction on reviewing and updating the protocols in Senate Bill 840. So we will be factoring that into our approach as we move forward.
Thank you, Mark. Our next commenter is Brian Beering. Following him will be Jonathan Kendrick. Brian Beering, I have allowed you to talk. You have 2 minutes for your public comment.
Thanks, Haley. This is Brian Beering with Beering and Brown, LLP. Am I coming through okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you, Brian.
Great, thanks, Mark. So my question is related to slides 32 through 34 on the electricity sector. I was curious if you had planned to make the study related to emissions leakage available, either in the rulemaking or prior to the rulemaking, and whether there was any update on any of the potential regulatory changes that might result from that, whether you're planning to look at changes to the resource shuffling provisions, or if there's any update on the timing of possibly removing the RPS adjustment. That was the first question. The other question I had was whether the mandatory reporting regulation changes would include any updates related to the implementation of the enhanced day-ahead market. And then finally, the last question I had was, I saw the market notice included an update on potential changes to corporate association disclosure rules. And I was curious if that was still planned to be part of the ISOR. Thanks.
Hi, Brian. This is Rajinder. I can help on this one. So on the electricity side, we are still working through some of the things that staff was workshopping earlier before we paused this rulemaking to allow for the legislature to take time to take up the extension. So we are going to be revisiting all of that work, and we'll want to talk through that with the stakeholders. There may be some changes to the RPS adjustment as we had discussed earlier, but again, we need to go back and look at those. And we had also been looking at CAG changes that had been workshopped. So again, many of the things that aren't presented here, we are still looking at to include in this rulemaking. But this rulemaking was really to focus on how we needed to pivot in a few key areas because of the newly signed statutes and how we were thinking of reflecting those. So refer you back to the work that we had before on our meetings and workshop list. All of that is still part of this conversation, and we're happy to engage on that and take any further comment. Just because it's not mentioned here doesn't mean it's outside the scope of this rulemaking. Thanks.
Thank you, Rajinder.
Oh, and then on the study, I'm sorry, your first question was on the study. We will want to make those analyses public so that stakeholders have access to those, yes.
All right, thank you. All right, our next commenter is Jonathan Kendrick. Following him will be Elizabeth Zeljat. Jonathan, I have allowed you to unmute your microphone. You have 2 minutes to present your public comment.
Good morning, John Kendrick on behalf of the California Chamber of Commerce. Would really like to express a lot of appreciation for the staff's transparency in outlining some of these early concepts for implementing AB 1207 and SB 840. Especially the acknowledgement that affordability and leakage minimization are central to the legislative intent. And I appreciate that you guys are looking at this with a strong eye. Businesses need a program that's both environmentally effective and economically sustainable. The proposed removal of roughly 118 million allowances through 2030 represents a significant tightening of the cap without a change of that magnitude could raise compliance and electricity costs well beyond what the legislature may have contemplated, especially for energy intensive or emissions intensive trade exposed sectors that have limited decarbonization pathways. I do appreciate some of the language around preserving the current cap adjustment factors. We feel that this has worked pretty well to prevent leakage and protect jobs. Little bit concerned to hear some of this concept of shifting away from industrial allocation to decarbonization incentives. When I look at other programs, if we're talking about grant making, a lot of times conditions are attached to grants that are not very palatable. That have a lot of, in my previous life as an attorney, represent a lot of people that walked away from CEC grants in particular because some of the conditions that were imposed on them. And so what you're doing at that point is you're narrowing the pool potentially of EITE who can benefit. Significant concerns as well on the CARB side. AB 1207 allows the commission to consider whether or not to continue to provide industrial assistance to EITE and the climate credit to small businesses. We believe that those should be preserved. Those credits directly offset rising energy costs that result from the Cap and Invest program.
Sorry, you have reached your 2 minutes. Thank you so much for your comment.
Thank you.
We'll be moving on to Elizabeth Zeljat. Elizabeth, I have unmuted your microphone. You can proceed.
Haley, I'll just acknowledge Jonathan's comment and say thank you. And please do follow up with written feedback on those points. I think, you're identifying the one need to think about things holistically and think about the program as it may be designed in the future and not as it has been in the past. So appreciate your raising those considerations and look forward to your written comments.
All right, Elizabeth, you are our next commenter, and you will be followed by Nora Sheriff. Elizabeth, I have given you permission to unmute your microphone. You have 2 minutes to provide your public comment.
Hello, are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thanks for taking my comment. It's more of a question. In terms of modelers working on cap trajectories that they should be incorporating into their models for allowance price projections, I had submitted a question beforehand about which year the new offset provision where allowances are deducted from the next year's allowance budget based on the offsets used in the previous year kicks in. It sounds like from the little blue box that you had in one of the slides, it will be officially 2027 for the amount of allowances cumulatively surrendered or canceled in 2026. I just wanted to make sure that I got that right or understood it correctly. And then also in terms of we're waiting for the final ISOR in terms of which supply option is going to be the one chosen, and it looks from the information provided here like you've sort of unofficially opted for supply option 1. Is that the case, and when can we expect the final ISOR?
So I can take this one. Staff mentioned that we're working towards an ISOR towards the end of the year. On which pool of allowances we've shared where we think that supply can come from. We are not taking a position right now other than flagging that we do believe that the intent language in AB 398 clearly says that we have price containment reserve tiers and a price ceiling to support cost containment. And there's very little that is in there that would suggest that we can use those allowances for anything else. And then just on the which year would the offset removal language, allowance removal for offset use language apply? That's in our market notice. We had clarified early on because we were getting questions that it would apply to the 2026 emissions year, which is trued up for compliance in 2027, and then that would be reflected in the 2028 vintage of allowances that would go to auction in 2028.
Thank you. All right, our next commenter is Nora Sheriff, and she will be followed by Nicholas Roy. Nora, I have allowed you to unmute your microphone. You have 2 minutes to provide your public comment.
Thank you and good morning. This is Nora Sheriff on behalf of CLECA, the California Large Energy Consumers Association. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. CLECA members represent a broad array of EITE designated industries such as cement, steel, industrial, and medical gas. I appreciate CARB's focus on preventing leakage and your recognition of the affordability concerns that really are paramount and increasing the risk of leakage. This means that the California Industry Assistance Program has grown even more important for the state's long-term climate goals. Competitive pressures on California's EIT industries have increased over the past decade. The California industrial electric rates have risen dramatically compared to the neighboring states' rates. They're now about 250% of the average rates of neighboring states. So the relief that the California Industry Assistance Program provides is crucial. It has to continue without interruption, and it has to be improved. So the recognition that the rulemaking timelines means 2027 is the earliest year for budget adjustments and other updates is good to hear for continuity. Hopefully that applies to the California Public Utilities Commission as well, but CLECA still has significant concerns. First, in the absence of a border carbon adjustment mechanism, we have to strengthen and improve the California Industry Assistance Program. But the contemplated transfer from the CPUC to CARB increases complexity and risk to the EITE companies. These include added costs due to accounting complications, tax consequences, and transactional complexity, and those have to be taken into consideration. And EITE entities must be made whole and not harmed by the change. Further, the industry assistance credits can encourage EITE companies to plan and make investments for decarbonization, but those investments will often increase in electricity demand.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Sorry, you have exceeded your 2 minutes.
Okay, we'll provide additional detail in our written comments. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Nora. Do provide that in writing, much appreciated. And I will note that, you know, the industry assistance program and allowance allocation at large is really meant to address cost concerns related to the Cap and Invest program and not the full suite of larger cost concerns that might be reflected due to, you know, other factors that impact rates on electricity.
Thank you, Mark. All right, our next commenter is Nicholas Roy. He will be followed by Mikhail Skvarla. Nicholas, I have given you permission to unmute. You may provide your public comment.
Hi, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Hi, my name is Nick Roy. I'm a research associate at Resources for the Future. We're nonpartisan, non-advocacy, nonprofit based in Washington, D.C., doing environmental economics research to inform important policies like this one. So I want to start by saying thanks to everyone at CARB and in this workshop today for engaging so thoughtfully on the development of the Cap and Invest program here in California. So I have two main questions and a third if I don't run out of time. In 2022, I remember Governor Newsom's executive order set a target for 48% below 1990 levels. And I believe that was part of how the 2022 scoping plan final draft, it was built around that plan. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, but it seems like we're returning to the originally legislative mandate of 40% below 1990 levels. And I wanted to get a better sense of like what the logic of that was. I could see how bringing offsets under the cap would be part of it, but perhaps there's more there. So just curious about that change first. The other is with the discussion of changes of free allocation to EITE sectors. I'm curious how much CARB is collaborating with Washington Department of Ecology and what the nature of that collaboration is, given the fact that they're also considering implementing changes to their EAT programs, and there might be in the upcoming legislative session some major policy changes there as well, and how much that's being coordinated between the two jurisdictions given their intent to link. And since I do have 40 seconds left, I guess I'll throw in just a third question rather. When we're talking about the incentives for industrial decarbonization, how much green financing mechanisms such as green banks using GGRF revenues are part of CARB strategy, and whether or not they would need additional legislative authority to be able to do that style of mechanism. Again, thank you so much for this opportunity to comment, as well as the hosting this workshop. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Nicholas. So I can take your questions. The statute that was passed by the legislature and signed into law by the governor very much references the targets in SB 32 and AB 1279. So that is what we are working towards, and that is where we are looking to align. The scoping plan, which was where we saw that 48% show up, really identified a smoother transition between 2023 and 2045. It also identified a significant amount of clean hydrogen and of CCUS being in the system. There was an uncertainty analysis that looked at what if we can't build out the grid fast enough, and also if there are some delays in how we electrify or get to zero transportation deployment targets. And that uncertainty analysis, we chose two things because we thought those two things, the grid and some of those regulations, may get the most reductions, but then may also have some vulnerabilities. And what we are seeing right now is that there is going to be some impact from delays in not being able to implement some of our vehicle regulations while we work through the litigation, which we will successfully work through. So that's why we see the 40% as something that is a more viable target, and it's supported by the statute that was just signed by the governor. For the Washington piece, we are collaborating very closely with our colleagues in Washington. The team here talks to them almost every single week on some facet of the program. And so we are going to be continuing to be coordinated and understand what they are doing in their different areas. As you saw on the slide, they are close to 100%, and we are close to 60% in terms of EITE protection for minimizing leakage. That's a significant gap. I don't think they're going to come down to 60%. And so I think we still have to think about what we are doing in the broader context with federal policy, with other programs, and not just what's happening in Washington. And that's why you saw the staff look at a broader array of programs. And then industrial decarb, we're open to feedback on what would be the most effective way to help with industrial decarbonization. Staff did not have a proposal here on the table, and if there's one that you'd like to offer, please put it into the docket. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next commenter will be Mikhail Skvarla, and he will be followed by Ken Johnson. Mikhail, I have given you permission to unmute. You may provide your comment.
Thank you. Appreciate the analysis that was provided this morning. I think it opens up the conversation for the continuation of the affordability discussion that's in the real politic of national and state, electorate and residents. I think as we look at the 118 smooth, and a couple years ago when we were having these conversations about the transition to the 2045 target, CEBA was open to kind of a more ambitious approach than this, with the impression that we'd be implementing in 2025. With these lost years, the 118 actually is reflective of that kind of middle path that was presented in 2024 and I think late 2023. So to that end, it is an ambitious target for the next 4 years to get those additional tons removed. And so as we look at affordability, we want to kind of elevate kind of the industrial assistance factors, the cap adjustment factors, and those analyses. And we appreciate what was put on the table, and we'll continue to look and analyze that. I do want to reflect, well, border carbon adjustment is something that I think is ultimately important in the long run. It does not equate to affordability. It is good leakage protection, but we need to make sure that the affordability elements come through. And to that end, as we start to look at The offset provisions, the assistance factors, and then other mechanisms potentially through utilization of revenues to help transition industries and the high road jobs associated with them to Californians. We're going to need to be creative and iterative over the next few years and potentially look at programmatic changes for the post-2030 element to ensure that the public is not unduly harmed by higher energy costs as we're experiencing today. These issues aren't going to get easier, and so to the extent that we can continue to work with CARB staff to bring that to light, especially in light of the federal administration and the loss of certain tools that were available to us just months ago, it will be important. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mick. Yeah, I really appreciate the considerations around affordability. I'll note that we did assess a range of allowance removals in the SRIA, which was released several months ago. Though the 118 million was really a minimum amount to be removed associated with the adjustment to the GHG inventory. And so I just wanted to note those removals and appreciate the input on the other aspects.
Thank you. Our next commenter is Ken Johnson. He will be followed by Clayton Munnings. Ken, I have allowed you to unmute. Please provide your comment. Ken, can you provide your comment, please? We can't hear you if you are speaking. All right. Hopefully Ken can get his technical issues sorted. I'm going to move to our next commenter, Clayton Munnings. Clayton, I have allowed you to talk. Please provide your comment.
Thank you. This is Clayton Munnings with Clean and Prosperous California. Just confirming you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. So just two provisional responses, one to slide 25, one to slide 43. So slide 25 on offsets under the cap. I wanted to flag that there seems to be arguably just a small hitch in implementing legislative direction here in terms of reducing the number of offsets the year right after compliance obligations are submitted. I believe, if my memory is correct, that compliance the compliance measurements, the emissions measurements, and the number of offset instruments used is about on a 1-year delay. So we won't know what was used to cover 2026 emissions until 2027, which I think means we can't reduce auctioned allowances until 2028. So I just wanted to highlight that. I think that is workable, and there's a way to implement legislative direction there. However, it does not speak to how to avoid foregone revenue in the legislature. And I do think that is a concern. I mean, 1.4 billion is a significant lost revenues. So we'll be commenting on that topic. The second comment is on industrial allocations, and I just want to highlight how 1207 highlights affordability, which I think also means product prices. And when we're deciding between the two options presented, I wanted to highlight that free allowance allocations do impact product prices. The more free allowances that are allocated, the lower product prices are for gasoline, steel, cement, housing. So I think affordability is an important element to consider when considering those two choices. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Clayton. Appreciate that. And I think your assessment of the timing of those potential allowance removals is accurate. When, for example, offset credits for the 2026 emissions would not be surrendered until November 2027, meaning those would need to be from future budgets. But look forward to seeing your written comments on that topic and related to the affordability items that you raised. Thank you.
Our next commenter is Sarah Tahiri. She will be followed by Dennis Burke. Sarah, I have given you permission to talk. Please provide your public comment.
Good morning. I'm Sarah Tahiri, and I represent San Diego Gas and Electric and Southern California Gas Company. First, I just want to thank the CARB team for the detailed run through today. It was a lot of content. We'll be looking at it in greater detail, and like others, we'll plan to follow up in writing. But before then, we'll offer some initial comments today. SDG&E and SoCalGas have long supported the Cap and Trade, or now Cap and Invest program, as the most cost-effective means for achieving economy-wide GHG reductions. With the passage of AB 1207, CARB now has the opportunity to preserve and extend the benefits this program offers for years to come. But this calls for a thoughtful approach that puts affordability front and center. Cost containment measures, such as natural gas supplier and electric distribution utility allowance allocations, are essential to maintaining affordability. These allocations offer tangible benefits that are directly passed through to our customers via the line item California Climate Credit that's provided on April and October bills. That credit delivers real bill relief for millions of households and small businesses, and it's an essential affordability tool that needs to be preserved and strengthened. This year, SDG&E customers received around $160 in electric climate credits and almost $55 for the gas climate credit. And SoCalGas customers received almost $90 for the gas climate credit. So in closing, and I know there was a lot of focus on affordability throughout the presentation, we appreciate that. We encourage CARB to put forth a rule that continues to advance on our emissions reductions while maintaining affordability for all Californians, and especially protecting those that are in the most vulnerable communities against rising electricity and gas costs. Thanks very much for the consideration. Looking forward to working with you all as this process continues.
Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate those highlights.
All right, our next commenter is Dennis Burke. He will be followed by Aldo Mueller-Quintero. Dennis, I have allowed you to unmute your microphone. Please provide your public comment.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, well, thanks to CARB for putting on this presentation. My comments more has to do with the allocations to natural gas utilities. I'm with the City of Long Beach. We are Long Beach Utilities. And I just kind of want to point out, like in Long Beach, there has been a number of fuel cells put in throughout our territory, especially there is a large one down at the port area that powers a fuel cell that creates hydrogen as a vehicle fuel. I also want to point out that a number of our fleet vehicles were transitioned from diesel burning to natural gas, like street sweepers and buses. The thing is, none of them reached the point of being covered entities. So from a Long Beach standpoint, it looks like our natural gas usage isn't decreasing, but it's all these fuel efficient projects that are actually increasing our usage. I just want to make sure that this is being included with the allocations calculations, if that makes sense. You know, because a lot of our natural gas is being used for energy efficient projects and fuel cells and natural gas vehicles and whatnot. I just kind of want to make sure that this is considered when calculating the allowances to natural gas utilities. Thank you.
So I think there's two responses to this, and I'll take the first one, and then I think Rachel can jump in as well. Just on this point about the fuel cells and electrification, those units, if they're feeding electric transportation end uses, are probably getting LCFS credits. So that use of gas in that form is getting a credit on the transportation side, and how those contractual relationships on the value of that credit is being shared are outside of CARB's purview. And I know it's not just going to be isolated to Southern California. We could see some of these generating technologies put in other places across the state. But I'm going to give it to Rachel now to speak to the specific issue about allocation.
Great, thank you, Rajinder, and appreciate the comment, Dennis. I wanted to just highlight two things. One is that natural gas allocation, the methodology in the regulation is based on 2011 emissions for each natural gas supplier, declining by the cap adjustment factors. So that's the basis for that allocation in the regulation. And then the second piece is under 1207. I just want to make sure we're on the same page that that is going to impact natural gas allocation to investor-owned utilities, not publicly owned utilities. So wanted to clarify those two things, and thanks so much for your comment.
Our next commenter is Aldo Muller-Quintero. Following him will be Doug Carpa. Aldo, I have allowed you permission to unmute. You may provide your public comment.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, well, hi, I'm Aldo from S&P Global Commodity Insights, and I have two related questions regarding the cap trajectory and implementation of under the cap offset provision. First, regarding the 118 million allowance reduction through 2030, is this reduction applied entirely to the 2027, 2030 period? And if so, could you provide more detail on the annual caps for each of those years? Specifically, will the 118 million reduction be allocated linearly across 2027, 2030, or it will follow another distribution? And if so, if the year-by-year caps are not yet finalized, could you indicate when those specific figures are going to be released? And based on the presentation, I want to confirm my understanding of how the under the cap offset mechanism will operate. Is the 26 cap, let's assume that the 26 cap is 254 million allowances. So if we use 6% of that on offsets, will that mean that 15.2 million allowances will be reduced from the 28 cap? And if so, like it will be reduced on a rolling basis. For example, the offsets used in 27 are going to be removed from the 29 cap, and if the 2018 offsets used will be reduced from the 2030 cap. That's it.
Thank you, Aldo. Appreciate your interest. These are items that we are still working through. So those will be part of a proposal, those types of details on allowance budgets and exact details on the potential removals owing to offset credit use. That's where we're seeking input right here, right now. And so we want to factor that input into the proposal. So those will be clarified when we do put forward a proposal and the ISOR.
Thank you. Our next commenter is Doug Carpa. He will be followed by Denise Athy. Doug, I have given you permission to unmute. You have 2 minutes to provide your public comment.
Very good. Thank you very much. Doug Carpa from Peninsula Clean Energy. We are a CCA serving San Mateo County and the city of Los Banos. And I just wanted to, of course, thank you all for your careful and thoughtful work on refreshing the regulations on the program. And wanted to also to put in a quick plug for something that's maybe a little bit smaller than to have made the cut for the presentation today. But wanted to highlight that CCAs across the board, actually beyond importing hydro, we also engage in significant renewable and carbon-free procurement in excess of our regulatory requirements. And to reflect that, we are going to be putting in a proposal to renew the voluntary renewable energy program that essentially was exhausted in 2023, because it's critical to be able to recognize the decarbonization efforts of a lot of the cutting-edge load-serving entities out there who are going above and beyond. And I do want to emphasize that decarbonizing affordability is something that we do every single day. We're very, very focused on it, but we're also mindful that failing to reduce carbon emissions also incurs a cost. And if the social cost of emissions is higher than the allowance cost, that's not really affordability, because we're simply shifting costs from one account in terms of the people of California to another when people have to pay for the damage caused by emissions. So absence a mechanism to retire allowances to reflect the efforts going above and beyond, we run a risk that cap and invest becomes a bit of a floor for decarbonization as well as a cap. And so we're looking forward to working with you to work out a workable and ideally sort of revenue neutral proposal. So you'll see that coming forward in comments, but I want to put a bug in your ear about giving some thought to how we might get that done. So thanks very much.
Thanks so much for your comment, Doug, and we look forward to seeing the details of that proposal in our written comments. And, as Michael highlighted earlier in the presentation, when we look at the various options in front of us, we really have to think about every change and how it impacts the program as a whole. So just a reminder to everybody that that's always the approach that we're taking, and looking forward to those written comments. Thank you.
Our next commenter is Denise Cathy. She will be followed by Joseph Steyer. Sorry if I mispronounced that. Denise, you have permission to talk. You have 2 minutes.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. My name is Denise Cathy, and I'm a journalist with Argus Media. I primarily just had a question. My previous understanding of how CARB was accounting for carbon offsets in the program was that periodically, especially in the last extension rulemaking, that carbon offsets had been, or allowances comparable to max carbon offset use had been removed comparable to 2030. And correct me if that is not the correct understanding. Do we have a sense at this point in time, like how that would work as far as the required carbon offset use accounting that would need to happen going forward, no matter what system we end up with? And that was it for my question.
So that's actually a really helpful and good question. And this goes back to the way that we had historically addressed offsets under the cap. We have taken out allowances and we have put those into the cost containment tiers. We are not going to pull those back out. And so what we're looking at is having a forward approach of implementing the direction in 1207. And that is what staff was trying to workshop here, is like a plain read of that. Applying public data would result in this kind of predictable variability. Obviously, markets work best when there's smoothness and not so much volatility or variability from year to year. And so we are taking comment on how we can structure the 1207 requirement in a way that provides a smooth trajectory and predictability on what can be expected to go to auction. That also means we are trying to figure out how can we remove allowances in a way, maybe proactively or after the fact, that somehow minimizes that predictable volatility that staff showed in their graph and data.
Thank you. Our next commenter is Joseph Steyer. He will be followed by Joe Gardias. Joseph, I have unmuted you, or allowed you to unmute. You have 2 minutes to provide your comment.
Okay, thank you. Just mostly just a couple quick questions along those lines. The first one is, with the upcoming changes to the cap and trade regulation due to be done sometime next year, are we anticipating changes to the mandatory reporting regulation as well, since those two regulations tend to go hand in hand? Secondly, are we anticipating a decrease, to meet the change of like 40% to 48% reduction by 2030? Are we anticipating like a similar reduction of allowances available from 2027 to 2030, kind of like what was done in the reductions in the carbon intensity and LCFS program in the recently revised regulation? And also, are we anticipating like carbon sequestration being incorporated into like reporting or cap and trade regulation going forward? Thank you.
Hey Joe, this is Ryan Sholland with on the MRR side. So as you've heard on the past workshops, we will have a public process for MRR, kind of complementing the cap and invest process. So stay tuned for more information on that. And then for your other question, I think Rajender will handle that.
Thanks, Ryan. So just to be clear, when staff presented the removal of 118 million allowances, that is reflecting that lower tier that we've previously workshopped of the 3 options for scenarios for removals. And it is the technical adjustment for the inventory to align this program better with the adjustments that we made to the greenhouse gas inventory. That removal is really focused on 2027, 2028, 2029, and 2030 budgets, because the caps that were set for the rest of this decade were based on older inventory calibration for a modeling tool that we used way back in 2016 and 17. So I hope that clarifies the years, and I hope that clarifies that this is the 118, which is the lower bound in the 3 scenarios staff had workshopped previously. Thank you.
Our next commenter is Joe Gardias, and they will be followed by Bruce Magnani. Joe, I have given you permission to unmute your microphone. You have 2 minutes to provide your comment.
Thank you, Haley. I'm Joe Gardias with NRDC, and I similarly echo the thank yous to staff for their hard and thoughtful work on these updates. I have a question about the scope of the amendments. In particular, AB 1207 required the CPUC to distribute the residential climate credit in the 4 highest billing months. This requirement interacts with the previous prohibition in cap and trade regulations on the volumetric distribution of the residential climate credit with the intention of maintaining a price signal. Is CARB staff reevaluating this requirement within the current amendment process? Thank you.
So the answer is yes. We are making sure that we are collaborating closely with our colleagues at the CPUC and making sure that we are taking steps in this rulemaking to reflect that legislative direction. And we're joined by our colleague Adam, who may have more to add on work that they are undertaking here.
Yeah, CPUC currently has an open rulemaking R2507-013 to examine changes to the climate credit. So any technical or methodological changes or timing changes to comply with either changes in CARB rules or because of AB 1207 will be discussed and deliberated there. We've received open comments and reply comments. There's still no pre-hearing conference scheduled or a scoping memo. So stay tuned. I encourage people to sign up to that listserv to see changes to the climate credit that may be promulgated as a result of that rulemaking.
Our next commenter is Bruce Magnani. He will be followed by Christopher Templeman. Bruce, I have given you permission to unmute your microphone. You have 2 minutes to provide your comment.
Thank you. Bruce Magnani on behalf of the Coalition for Sustainable Cement Manufacturing and Environment. We appreciate the opportunity to comment today. CARB has already recognized the cement industry as being highly exposed to leakage, and this is due to a variety of factors. The cement industry has emissions intensity that is multiple times greater than virtually every other industry in California. And the fact is, cement is already imported to California from Asian countries halfway around the world. Additionally, the cement industry is a difficult to decarbonize industry and has very few options to cost effectively reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and mitigate the full impact of carbon prices. And this is due to process emissions. As a result of these factors, there is already a shift of production and the associated emissions to out-of-state producers. We believe the next logical step is to implement an incremental border carbon adjustment to allow for useful containment of risk leakage. And the incremental border carbon adjustment should also be followed up with a pausing of the cap adjustment factor. This will allow CARB and the cement industry space to transition to a more effective leakage prevention system. We're encouraged that CARB is looking for ways to fill the vacuum from the loss of federal funds. One great example is National Cement's Net Zero project was awarded $500 million in a grant from the U.S. Department of Energy for its first of a kind CCUS program, and that money was taken away. So we're hoping that CARB will use GGRF funds to help decarbonize this difficult to decarbonize industry and invest not only in R&D, but in known systems such as industrial process heat recovery that will generate zero carbon electricity on site for self-consumption. And we have a lot more comments. Sure.
Please provide your public comments to our docket and include any data or any additional information that you would like to with that.
Absolutely. There's a lot in this presentation, and the industry is deeply involved in many of these areas. So we will provide in-depth written comments. I will say that the November 12th timeframe is very tight, but we also understand that you are also under tight timeframes. If there's a chance to extend that a little bit, we would appreciate it.
Thank you so much. All right, our next commenter is Christopher Templeman. Christopher, if you have, I've given you permission to talk. Our next commenter will be Sam Harper.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
All right. I'm assuming you can hear me. Rajinder, most of these questions are for you, which I'm sure you're aware of. And again, I apologize for that. Glad that you guys were able to get this webinar up so quickly after the legislation. I know that was probably an awful lot of work. And you met the October timeline, which I think was very impressive. So first question, you mentioned that 118 million reduction is effectively the old scenario one. My question there would be, does that mean that the other higher scenarios are still in consideration? So is there a higher number than 118 that's also being considered to match the older scenarios in the previous thinking? Secondly, Rajinder, you'd mentioned that we're not going to take any of the allowances out of the APCRs that had previously been put in there to account for offset usage. So does that mean that the new provisions under 1207 are in essence over and above anything that's been done previously on offsets and should be viewed as additional offsets accounting? And then last, one question on the linkage. Will there be a parallel process for linkage? And when is the earliest that you could see a linkage to Washington occurring? And then very lastly, I'm going to read quickly because I only have 30 seconds. Obviously, affordability is a big issue. I think one of the questions that I have, though, is when you look at the scoping plan, carbon capture is very important in meeting the mandates. And most of the studies suggest that unless carbon prices get to be thin $80 to $100, carbon capture just doesn't pencil out. So how do you sort of manage the conflict between affordability and the fact that you want market prices to get to a price that justifies carbon capture? And those are all my questions. I think I hit my 1 minute, my 2 minutes.
That last part where you acknowledged it, you were maybe 5 seconds over, but I'm going to take your questions. So the 118 is the scenario that staff is proposing here. If there are comments about other scenarios that we should still consider or any of the ones that were presented earlier, please submit those comments in the docket. On the APCR, like I said, we did move allowances into the APCR at the very beginning of the program to reflect offsets under the cap, but also support the cost containment mechanisms. We do believe that AB 398 does specifically want those allowances in the APCR used as cost containment. That's why we are not suggesting that we have the ability to just pull those out. And cost containment for those tiers is very, very important just to the overall program. And then when we talk about 1207 moving forward, if all of the offsets haven't been utilized against everything that's been used to populate the APCR on the price ceiling, then we would be taking more allowances moving forward to account for the 1207 provision. Linkage with Washington, the earliest, I've said this publicly before, if we are able to get to the board by the middle of or the early part of next year, Q2, and then have this reg in effect by September 1, 2026, which is what we need to be able to adjust the budgets for 4 years. We would be working behind the scenes on things like analyses to understand the SB 1018 findings, but we would have to undertake a subsequent rulemaking to actually do linkage, and that would put us probably closer to Q2, Q3 of 2027 for linkage to be in effect. Of course, assuming that all the SB 1018 findings are sufficient and that we have stable programs in Quebec, California, and Washington for us to do those kinds of evaluations. That's why it's a bit critical for us to be able to land this rulemaking package, because Quebec and Washington are actively looking to update programs, and the sooner we all have somewhat stable programs, we can do those analyses. CCUS, still very important. You know, Executive Officer Dr. Cliff was at a groundbreaking for a project just last week, Carbon TerraVolt 1. And so that was a great step for California to be able to show that we can start maximizing some of the tools out there and actually break ground in California on a project. There are many things that can help support CCUS. That project is moving ahead in the absence of what's going on here in the rulemaking or allowance prices. And so we are seeing a lot of interest and movement on these projects, even while we're working through this rulemaking, and we're seeing the prices that we have today. So I think there's stacking of financial instruments that is happening out there and helping. I think the issue is really, how do we incorporate it back into the cap and trade program? We've always been clear. We would always recognize CCUS or from a compliance entity, carbon from a compliance entity, as something that reduced your compliance obligation. That's been policy in the rulemaking package since day one. What we need to do is wrap up the SB 905 rulemaking. We will be adding language into this package, recognizing that the methods that are developed under SB 905 would be eligible to count in this aspect for reducing the compliance obligation. Thanks.
Our next commenter is Sam Harper. They will be followed by Jonah Kerman-Faber. Sam, I have given you permission to unmute your microphone. You have 2 minutes to provide your comment.
Hi there, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Well, hello, Sam Harper here representing industrial manufacturers in general, and these comments are focused on steel in particular. And I just want to thank CARB in general and in this presentation in particular for the focus on mitigating emissions leakage. You know, it's critically important to the success of the overall state carbon program, and it's also critical to the state economy and the supply of critical materials to the state of California. And I think CAPA adjustment factor and the idea of funding decarbonization projects are really interesting and certainly the appropriate areas to focus on to mitigate carbon emissions. I thought the slide comparing California industrial allocation to covered emissions in other jurisdictions was quite interesting, that the coverage ratio in California is dramatically lower than other ratios, and the recognition that that's mostly related to the cap adjustment factor. And so I think it's the right area to focus on. And just to emphasize that that is true for both direct and indirect emissions, the cap adjustment factor. And lastly, I want to just encourage CARB to look at industries that may need more focused adjustments to the program. So for example, the raw steel sector has entirely left the state, with 100% of raw steel being imported today. And so however effective mitigations have been overall, the steel sector emissions leakage have not been adequately mitigated. And so sectors like steel with high intensity and stream trade exposure may need more focused consideration. And thank you for the time, and plan on submitting written comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Sam, and look forward to seeing your comments. Thanks for the context and input.
Our next commenter is Jonah Kerman-Faber. Following him will be Anna Ferreira. Jonah, I have given you permission to unmute your microphone. Please provide your comment.
Thank you very much. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Awesome, thanks. Jonah Kerman-Faber, Greenline Insights. We're a research firm that does in-house modeling on state cap and invest programs, including California. And so my questions for today are really from that perspective of modeling and what kind of data would be most helpful for decision making at this time. You know, there's a number of provisions we've discussed today, and a lot of them, you know, impact each other. And you know, moving through all different permutations of those decisions is obviously a lot of different would be a lot to undertake for hitting all of them through a modeling perspective. And then also if you add in sensitivities of, you know, future emissions, fuel prices, technology costs, then obviously it gets like, you know, not feasible to hit it all. So I was curious if there's any commentary from CARB on a couple things. One is if there's a certain sequence to these decisions that you guys have in mind that might help, you know, outside analysis with the decisions, you know, which provisions you'd like to see held constant and others, you know, played with or optimized under those scenarios. It's a bit open-ended of a question, but any way you feel might be helpful to answer to help, you know, modeling fill in the gaps for what is, you know, such a large body of potential permutations of modeling that could be done. So I'll open it up to you guys on that.
Thanks, Jonah. I don't think we can really speak on kind of any specific sequencing. I think things that you're highlighting related to, you know, many levers that can potentially influence the program and the need to assess those holistically is important. And I think it's also important to reiterate and remember the uncertainty inherent in a lot of these types of modeling efforts. Again, you know, we will be providing an initial proposal as part of our initial staff report that we're aiming to put out by the end of this year, hopefully. And but I don't think I have anything additional to add about specific sequencing at this point. Virginia?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And I will just note that we've had probably a handful of inquiries from external stakeholders who are trying to do technical work, asking us similar types of questions, or how things should be modeled, or where priorities should be. Because this is a market program with an active secondary market overseen by the federal CFTC agency, we, as the market administrator, will not weigh in on those inquiries and questions, because that is the kind of information about where we see opportunities or things that we see open for change or adjustment could inform decisions for market participants. And those are the kinds of information that we would want to make available to everyone, so it's not just made to a limited few. So it's not that we are not wanting to help or engage, we just don't feel that that is an appropriate place for us as the market administrator, given the nature of the secondary market and its relationship to who we are. Thanks.
Thank you for your comment. Our next commenter is Anna Ferreira. and she will be followed by Xavier Zame. Anna or Anna, I have unmuted your, or allowed you the option to unmute. Please provide your comment.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay? I'm assuming the clock started. Yes, it's Anna. Echoing the thanks for the detail and explanation in this presentation. Also that you'll be considering affordability, which is paramount to our winery members. I'm with Wine Institute. We represent wineries up and down the state. You kind of answered the questions I had, but I'll just, for clarification's sake, we've had members interested in when the allowance removal in 1207 will begin, and I think I heard loud and clear that it would be data starting 2026 that would inform a vintage year. Thank you for that that use of language. In 2027 that would go to auction in 2028. And I also heard November of 2027. So whatever clarification you can provide on that. And then our members were also interested in how that allowance would be implemented. Which annual budget? Are you talking about a company that retires 5,000 offsets to meet their compliance obligation, that their allowances would be reduced by 5,000, or is that something that would be reduced for all businesses? Or will this be implemented in another way? And those are my questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. I think it's important to clarify that the removals of allowances from budgets is a programmatic move. So once offsets would be used for compliance, that amount would be removed from the overall supply by some mechanism. This is not an entity-specific provision where an entity that uses offset credits for its compliance sees any impact to its allowance allocation. This is a removal from the overall program budgets. So I think that's important to note. And then just as an illustrative example, I'll choose 2027 as an emissions year. Compliance for those emissions, well, 30% of those emissions would be in 2028, during which offset credits could be removed. So if we're planning sequentially, as was illustrated in the slide deck by Michael, that would result in potential earliest removals from the 2028 allowance budget.
Thank you. Our next commenter is Xavier Zame, and our following commenter will be Annie Gustafson. Xavier, I have allowed you permission to unmute. You may provide your comment.
Great. Thank you for taking my question. My name is Xavier Zime. I'm a market participant. The current staff proposal includes removing approximately 118 million allowances through 2030. Should we think about the quote unquote moving offsets under the cap as additional removals above and beyond the 118 million allowances indicated in the removal pathway? Or is that not the right way to think about how the program will tighten over the next couple of years? Thanks.
So those are two very different things in the program. We've been talking about removing the 118 for technical adjustment for probably several workshops that have happened over the past year and a half or 2 years. So that is a technical adjustment independent of any policy direction or any kind of need in the program. It's just about us doing good math. The offsets usage piece and removing allowances, that is a policy piece of legislation that we are trying to implement in the program. And so we don't think removing 118 is the response to addressing offset use under the CAB. Those are two different things.
Our next commenter is Annie Gustafson. She will be followed by Dan Lashoff. Annie, I have given you permission to unmute. You may provide your comment.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for this workshop and for the opportunity to lead questions and feedback. This is Annie Gustafson from the Clean Power Alliance, a load-serving entity in California and a community choice aggregator and the nation's leading provider of 100% green power. I'd like to echo Dev Kartha's earlier comments. We participate in the Greenie program, which requires that carbon allowances back up our voluntary purchases. In the past, we have used the Voluntary Renewable Energy Program, which provided free allowances to participants in voluntary renewable energy programs. This allowed us to show that our participation in these programs goes above and beyond state requirements. The pool of allowances from VREP ran out in 2023, and procuring carbon allowances to back up these purchases is burdensome and could impact abilities to run voluntary programs. Will this pool be refilled through this amendment to the program or otherwise in the future?
Hey, Annie, thank you so much for your comment and really appreciate the question. We'd love to hear from you in written comments what you think we should do on this item. And, as I indicated to Doug earlier, it's one of the items in the mix for sure. I think we've talked about it in prior workshops as well. And again, it's part of the holistic analysis of what's needed for the program to meet all of the required goals. So thank you so much.
Our next commenter is Dan Lashoff, and he will be followed by Ignacio Valdivia. Dan, I have given you permission to unmute. Please provide your comment.
Thank you, and thanks for this. I'm Dan Lashoff with the World Resources Institute and want to speak in support of the concept of incentivizing emission reduction projects at energy-intensive trade-exposed industries as a way to combat leakage. I think that will be the most, in addition to considering a border adjustment, directly investing in California's industry in ways that reduce emissions will be both beneficial to the state, but also to global efforts for decarbonization. I have a question related to this, which is how CARB is thinking about this program in relationship to the Climate Technology Innovation Fund established by AB 840 and or SB 840 and where when CARB is going to whether CARB is planning workshops on the development of implementation of SB of that innovation fund. Thank you.
Hi, Dan, this is Rajinder. So that is a great flag that 840 included language on the Innovation Fund. That is separate and outside of the conversation that we were doing here. That fund has a limited amount of money in it. And obviously this program has a limited amount it can do when we know that the industrial sector has lost more than that in terms of federal incentives to actually help decarbonize the hard to decarbonize sectors. So right now, what we'll be doing is working through this process, and as more clarity is there on requirements for the use of the money for the Innovation Fund and how it will be distributed, we'll do that separately, but keeping in mind in the implementation of that fund, we will have to take into account any decisions that we make here. Thank you. Thanks for flagging that that fund was there.
Our next commenter is Ignacio Valdivia. He will be followed by Evan Edgar. Ignacio, I have given you permission to unmute. Please provide your comment.
Good morning, Ignacio Valdivia, Sustainability Manager for Holiday Rock. CARB is considering a manufacturing decarbonization incentive that would repurpose a portion of industrial allowances to help facilities fund electrification, renewable energy, integration, and other decarbonization upgrades. The presentation references Quebec's model, where revenues from industrial allocations finance decarbonization projects within covered sectors. This could be an important mechanism for cement and concrete manufacturers as the sector faces high heat requirements, limited low-cost abatement options, and the loss of certain federal and industrial decarbonization grants. Question: will CARB consider directing cap and invest proceeds or industrial allocation value towards targeted decarbonization incentives for hard-to-abate sectors such as cement and concrete? For instance, could facilities receive credit or allowance value for capital projects that demonstrate measurable reductions in process emissions, such as installation of mineralization systems, use of high SCM cements, or electrifying operations? Additionally, CARB Cap and Invest program maintains industrial leakage protection as a key element. In the cement, lime, gypsum, and clay product sector, free allowance allocation helps prevent production from shifting to regions with weaker carbon rules. However, the cement and aggregate industries face distinct challenges. Cement is carbon intensive and trade exposed. Aggregate and ready-mix concrete are not covered directly, but price impacts from the cement supply chain affect competitiveness, project cost, and low carbon adoption. AB 1207 gives CARB post-2030 flexibility to redesign allocation to minimize leakage and support cost-effective compliance. Question: how will CARB ensure future industrial allocation updates reflect the interconnected nature of cement, aggregates, and ready-mix production? And will it consider a differentiated leakage risk approach that accounts for downstream cost impacts on the broader concrete sector and construction competitiveness? Thank you.
Thank you, Ignacio, for flagging those concerns and those sector-specific concerns. I think, we don't have specific information yet. I think that's part of this conversation, is to assess the need for further incentive for decarbonization in the manufacturing sector and how that might be structured. So, appreciate if you can consider specific details and provide that in writing. But given the context of where we are with federal funding, this is something we're assessing because of the importance of that sector to the economy and the challenge for reducing emissions there. So to the extent that you can provide detail in writing about how this type of incentive might be structured, I think that will be useful for us to factor into any final proposal.
Thank you. Our next commenter is Evan Edgar. He will be followed by Sarah Nolani Olson. Evan, I have unmuted you or allowed you permission to unmute. Please provide your comment.
Hello, my name is Evan Edgar. I'm an engineer for the California Compost Coalition. We represent public and private refuse fleets and biomethane developers. What I heard today in the presentation was a transition off natural gas. I didn't hear anything about renewable natural gas and to take things and how to decarbonize hard to decarbonize industries. Well, I represent the private fleets and we make biomethane for our own fleets and we like to continue to do so. We're not under the ACF. The public fleets are, where the public fleets are still under ACF, where they are making biomethane. And CARB is saying that we need to take that to hard to decarbonize industries. And meanwhile, if we're going on ZEV batteries, we are leaking emissions onto third world and places that are mining batteries. So what is needed here is a CARB commitment from 3.5 years ago to have a workshop on the future of biomethane. We see pieces of it here and there. Right now, the biomethane is under the low carbon fuel standard for the public fleets, and that's working great. But if we have to no longer use biomethane for under the low carbon fuel standard, it will transition to hard to decarbonize industries under cap and trade, and people will use up biomethane for other purposes. And the biomethane we can't use at the biomat program in the future because PUC is getting rid of that. So there's a lot of intersecting issues here. CARB is obligated to have this workshop on the future of biomethane for 3.5 years. They have not. And all these issues we spoke about today is important because a future biomethane should be for transportation fuels. It should not be available to hard to decarbonize communities under cap and trade where they would use renewable natural gas. So there's a lot of issues here, and hopefully CARB can fulfill their commitments on a workshop for the future of biomethane. Thank you.
Thanks for those comments, Evan. We will factor those into thinking and appreciate your input here.
Our next commenter is Sarah Nalani Olson. She will be followed by Alicia Robinson. Sarah, I have allowed you permission to unmute. Please provide your comment.
Thank you so much, Sarah Olson, on behalf of Environmental Defense Fund. Really appreciate you all for hosting this workshop and for the many considerations that were put on the table with today's presentation. Just one question from me today. Does CARB plan to address the requirement under AB 1207 for consumer rebates at the price ceiling, specifically the creation of the California Climate Mitigation Fund, or is that something that will be taken up with a later rulemaking? That's all for me.
So this is Rajinder. I can take that. Of course, we want to add language that is in alignment with what the statute requests us to do. We ourselves do not create funds or manage funds. We don't have that authority in the legislation. But to the extent that there's an intersection with what's in our regulation, we will want to make sure it's in alignment with what is in the legislation as written. Thanks.
Our next commenter is Alicia Robinson. She will be followed by Aldo Muller-Intero. Alicia, I have given you permission to unmute. You may provide your comment.
Thanks very much. This is Alicia Robinson from Elevate Climate. I first want to thank staff for their very hard work in preparing this workshop and all the work they've done on the pre-rulemaking process to date, as well as for the opportunity to comment today. My comment is that the inclination to retire allowances from auctioned pools to account for offset usage and the inclination to protect allowances in the APCR and price ceiling pools when making the technical adjustments that you also referred to appear to me to be well-reasoned and, in my view, consistent with legislative direction in AB 398 and AB 1207. Regarding offsets under the cap, I also wanted to thank CARB for the opportunity to provide comments on the requested potential alternatives to minimize the predictable variability caused by the envisioned implementation. And our team has been working on a white paper on this framework, and we look forward to submitting, again, comments in response to that request for feedback. Two very quick questions. I wanted to confirm that I heard Rajinder correctly, that we will likely see staff's proposal regarding what pool or pools of allowances the pre-2031 allowance removals will come from in the eyesore. And if so, that staff is therefore still open to receiving comment on potential options in the upcoming comment period following this workshop. And the second question is regarding the transition of support from natural gas to electrical utilities required under AB 1207. I was just wondering if CARB could comment at a high level on how CARB's work to implement this legislative direction interacts with the ongoing CPUC proceeding that is focused on enhancing the climate credit. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Alicia. So I can start on these, and then if my colleague from CPUC would like to jump in on their proceeding, that would be welcome. So on the pools of removals for what we're talking about here, yes, that would have to be in the eyesore because we have to open, sections of the regulation as part of a formal rulemaking. And then once those sections are open as part of the 45-day, we can continue to iterate on those. If you have comments on those, we would love to see the feedback and appreciate the comments there. On the proceeding over at the PUC, I'm just going to say that as we get direction on work that intersects CARB and the PUC work, we have regular staff meetings and we have regular senior leadership meetings. And that goes up to President Reynolds, Chair of CARB, myself, my counterparts. And so we are very, very much tracking and collaborating with our colleagues at the PUC. Adam, is there anything you want to offer more specific on the proceeding?
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, it's R2507-013. If anyone wants to follow along, we've just received opening comments and reply comments. We don't yet have a pre-hearing conference scheduled or scoping memo. So as that proceeding develops and moves along and we have more specific proposals from parties or internally, or more things come into focus from CARB about how the gas and electric credits may move forward, we'll maintain our close collaboration and working with CARB to make sure that everything is in alignment and in step so that it can roll forward smoothly and have a seamless outcome for customers of the state's electric and gas investor-owned utilities.
Thank you. Oh, we only have one hand raised left, so I will pass it off to Aldo Quintero again. You are allowed to unmute. Please provide your comment.
Hi, thanks a lot for giving me another chance to ask, but I have a follow-up question to my previous one. I would like, if it's possible for you to clarify to which budget years the 180 million allowances reduction applies to. Is it will be only to the 27 and 2030 budget, or to which years is it going to be applied? This 818 million allowances reduction, because I didn't got the chance to see it explicitly confirmed in the presentation or heard it before.
Right. Again, this 118 million is for a greenhouse gas inventory adjustment. And we have discussed removing those from the budget years 2027, 28, 29, and 30.
We have a few more hands up. First, I will go to Diane Doucette, and Evan Edgar, you can follow her. Diane, I have given you permission to unmute. Please provide your comment.
Thank you. This is Diane Doucette with Project 2030. Thank you so much for this presentation today. AB 1207 directs CARB to consider a CDR offset protocol. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you envision the protocol development process happening, what the timing is like, and what the public process will be like.
Hi, I can take that one because the intersection is with SB 905, which is the carbon capture utilization and storage program that was signed into law, I believe, in 2022. The offset protocol would have to meet all the requirements in AB 32 for offsets that we currently use in the cap and trade program or cap and invest program, but the methodology itself would have to be part of the SB 905 process, because that actually provides more detail on what the projects need to do themselves in terms of monitoring, reporting, in terms of permanence and financial liability instruments. And so that is where we will not just look at geologic sequestration, but other forms of sequestration and maybe even utilization for captured CO2, whether from ambient air or smokestacks. Obviously, if it's captured from a smokestack, it would be a reduction in the compliance in the cap and trade program. If it's captured from ambient air, it would function as an offset in the cap and trade program. So there's going to be work that is proceeding and kicking off on that. We had an open solicitation for information that closed several weeks ago on SB 905 to inform that rulemaking. All of that information is public on that website. But I think you are appropriately flagging that there is a nexus here between these two efforts. And while cap and trade is moving ahead, it will have language in it that points to SB 905. SB 905 will be where all the technical work happens. Thanks.
All right, one more hand raised. Evan Edgar, I'm giving you permission to talk. please provide your comment.
Evan Edgar on behalf of the California Compost Coalition. My second bite at the apple here has to do with representing all the organic composters statewide. We have the majority of Title 14 compost, and we're having under the voluntary market, we're creating carbon credits for sequestering carbon into the soil. This is carbon being sequestered in the soil for Healthy Soils initiatives. Under 1207, there was a statement about moving the offsets up from 4% to 6% with, and they did mention natural working lands and nature-based carbon offsets. So in the vein of the last question about, the what's the upcoming protocol to process in order to add protocols, because we have a lack of protocols out there. CARB hasn't developed new regulatory protocols for a while. And then with 1207, looking at nature-based, is there a process to include these nature-based, high-integrity voluntary carbon credits into a regulatory protocol? Thank you.
So just like with mechanical sequestration under SB 905, that is also where we would look for sequestration in natural and working systems, such as soil and other things like shrublands and rangelands, et cetera, and marine CDR. I think the issue that we continue to face is that there is very stringent criteria on offsets used for compliance under cap and trade, and that requires additionality, real, quantifiable, enforceable, and the big one is permanence. If there's data that you have or anybody has on how some of the nature-based solutions can ensure permanence, that would be really great to have submitted into the docket. For us, it's just making sure we have all the right data and the up-to-date state of the science to be able to show our work when we say that these protocols or these opportunities to sequester carbon meet all the requirements in statute. Thanks.
All right, that concludes our public comment period, and I will hand back to Mark for our closing remarks.
Thank you, Haley, and thank you to all of the folks who joined online and to those who spoke up, asked questions. These conversations are very helpful to us, and just want to express appreciation for your spending time to pay attention and provide input to the program considerations. Just to close, I want to highlight information on the Cap and Invest program webpage. I need to put $1 in the jar. So we've got a few assessments related to the program. I just want to note that the Cap and Invest webpage is really always the primary source of information for the latest information on the program. For accurate data, we do provide regular updates to provide transparency into the program. And here we're highlighting some links to some specific additional assessments we've done related to local air pollution and allowance supply and the forest offsets protocol. But all of it can be found at our Cap and Invest webpage, in addition to all of the materials such as this slide deck and all of the previous slide decks from this ongoing series of pre-rulemaking workshops. So please avail yourselves of that information. And to close, just want to highlight that we are accepting written comments in response to this workshop through November 12th. The link is provided here to connect to the comment docket. With that, I just want to again thank you all for your interest and participation, and look forward to future interactions in developing the program. Thank you so much.